Good morning, everybody. I woke up with a little bit of a frog in my throat this morning, so I'm going to try to push through. I'm feeling my voice is a little scratchier. I hope that doesn't dull your Parashat Shavua experience too much. It's good to see all of you from near and far. Shout out to all you West Coast people in North America. It's early in the morning for you. And I saw we have friends from Europe with us as well. I love just the eclectic collection of people who come together to study Torah with My Jewish Learning. I'm going to put in the chat right now a link to the slides that I'm going to share. I'm going to share the slides on the screen, but if you want to see them, it's set up for you to have permission to view the slides on your own or take a peek at them later. And I just put that chat in the, just put the link in the chat. Okay, so let's get started. Parashat Pinchas is chock full of things. And since we're sitting here in the middle of the summer, and I don't know about where you are, but it's been in the 90s where I am for the last couple days, and it's going to be that way for the next few. And that made me think about wintertime. And today what I'd love to talk about is a connection between Parashat Pinchas and the winter holiday of Hanukkah. We're going to travel some distance from one to the other. If you're a fan of Hanukkah, this could be a good lesson for you, and you'll see the connection to Pinchas. So that's the teaser for today. All right, I'm sharing my screen and going to my slides. And now I'm going to start the slideshow. All right. The end of Parashat Pinchas, chapters 28 and 29, starts with the following opening verses. God spoke to Moses saying, command the Israelite people and say to them, be punctilious in presenting to me at stated times the offering of food due to me as offerings by fire of pleasing odor to me. It's a good translation of the Hebrew, a little clunky sentence, the way it plays out in English. And not only do I like this because I like the word punctilious that appears in these verses, but these verses introduce two chapters of the Torah that list the sacrifices that the Israelites were commanded to bring to the temple, and doing so, and at the times they have to do. So it starts with the daily sacrifice and goes to then the monthly sacrifices for a new month, and then shifts to the special sacrifices that are brought in each of the holidays. So first, just about Parashat Pinchas and these chapters. If you're someone who's a Torah reader and is looking for learning Torah readings efficiently, like ones that you can learn and then use lots of times during the year, Bamidbar chapter 28 and 29, not only do we read this week, but sections of it we read on each of the holidays and on Rosh Chodesh when we celebrate a new month. If you're a Torah reader and you learn these two verses, you will serve your congregation well, because there are sections you can read on Sukkot and Passover and Shavuot and the rest of the holidays. Or vice versa, if you read these passages on the holidays, you're ready to read for Parashat Pinchas as well. So following these verses is a whole long list of sacrifices that people present. Keep in the back of your mind the teaser. It's going to all circle back to Hanukkah, which is not one of the holidays on the list, because Hanukkah is not a biblical holiday. The events of the story of Hanukkah happened after the close of the Bible, so it's a holiday that was instituted later by the Maccabees themselves and solidified by the rabbis. So the Hanukkah doesn't have specific sacrifices or a specific Torah reading about Hanukkah because there's no Hanukkah in the Torah. There we go. So now we're going to jump way across Jewish tradition to the Talmud, to Masechet Shabbat, to learn one source about studying Hanukkah. About celebrating Hanukkah. I don't know if you know this, but the Talmud presents two ways to light the candles. And this is one of those times where the Talmud presents two ways to light Hanukkah candles. But pretty universally, the Jewish people light just one way. Although every time I teach this text somewhere, there's always one or two people who say, I'm going to try it the other way next year. So, there's a sprinkling of people who do the other way. But I'm going to start with the bottom paragraph because that's the familiar one. Beit Hillel, the house of Hillel, teaches on the first day of Hanukkah, we light one candle, and from there on, we gradually increase. Right, that's how we do it. One Hanukkah candle and the shamash, right, the lighter candle, on the first day, and then two on the second day, and then three on the third day until you get to 8 at the end. As opposed to Beit Shammai, who does it the other way. Beit Shammai starts with 8 candles on the first day, and they say start with 8 and then gradually decrease. 7 on the second day, 6 on the third day, et cetera, et cetera. And so on the last day of Hanukkah, there's only one candle, and then Hanukkah ends. So before we get to more sources, I'm gonna stop sharing so I could see the chat. Think about like the Hillel and or Shammai way. If you know this, if you've seen this text before, don't spoil the answer that's coming. But what might be the reason to increase candles, and what might be the reason to decrease candles? If you have some thoughts about why do one or the other, plop those into the chat, and we'll see our own rabbinic thinking about how do we explain these rituals. But I'm pausing as I see on my big screen of a lot of you that some people are typing. Nice. Danielle says, increasing candles, bringing more light. Increasing seems latently hopeful because things get better over the holiday. Lois says, every night less oil. Right, the oil, right? If you have a lot of oil at the beginning of Hanukkah, right, you have less at the end. Nice. So each succeeding day brings more of a miracle. So as the miracle grows, right, the story in the Talmud about Hanukkah is, right, there was only one little thing of oil and it lasted longer than it was supposed to. Another day we'll look at that story. There are other stories about where the Hanukkah miracle might lie. Nice. We have a good selection of possibilities. And I'm going back to the share screen. Thank you for your thoughts. So here's what the Talmud said. The Talmud has a couple different answers. One of the answers actually is some of what some people said, increasing, right? You want to, the holiday builds, more light, more days, or, you want to mark how much time is left, and that's why it shrinks. But there's one opinion in the Talmud that brings these reasons to explain what Beit Hillel and Shammai are saying. One says, right, Beit Shammai's opinion is that the number of lights correspond to the bulls of the festival of Sukkot. I'm going to come back to that. And the reason for Beit Hillel's opinion is that you increase in sanctity and you don't decrease. So some of your comments that were about Beit Hillel echoed that. There's a principle, malin bekodesh ve'ein moridin. As you do a mitzvah, you're supposed to add to its holiness and sanctity, and it should go up, and you shouldn't decrease. So the celebration should become bigger. Some of you said that in the chat to support Hillel's piece. I don't think I saw anyone say this, that Beit Shammai's opinion corresponds to the bulls of the festival of Sukkot. That's actually the link that connects us back to Parashat Shavua this week, which is why I hope you'll see, while it's a journey, all the way to Kislev in December we're taking, it is found in Parashat Pinchas. And now I'm back to this week's Parsha. As we have the verses about the holidays, we get eventually to the holiday of Sukkot. And it says in the Torah, on the 15th day, in this week's Parsha, on the 15th day of the 7th month, that's the first day of Sukkot, you observe a sacred occasion, you shall not work at your occupation. 7 days you shall observe a festival to God. That's the holiday of Sukkot. Present a burnt offering, an offering by fire, a pleasing odor to God. Note this: 13 bulls of the herd, 2 rams, 14 yearling lambs, and all of these animals should be without blemish. So on the first day of Sukkot in the temple, the special Sukkot offering included 13 bulls, 2 rams, 14 lambs, not blemished. So I just want to go back to the previous slide. So Shammai said, start with 8, go down to 1, corresponding to the bulls of the festival Sukkot. You might be saying, wait, this says 8 bulls. So maybe if Shammai says Hanukkah is like Sukkot, why do we start with 8 and not 13? Well, actually, that's because Shammai's making the parallel in a little bit of a different way. Because while on the first day, there are 13 bulls, on the second day of Sukkot, I'm quoting from the next verses that come in this chapter, the second day there are 12 bulls of the herd, 2 rams, 14 lambs without blemish, etc. And on the third day, 11 bulls and the other animals are the same. And on the fourth day, 10 bulls and the other animals are the same. You see a pattern here when we for the sacrifice for Sukkot, described in this week's Parashat Shavua, the number of bulls goes down 1 each day. So it doesn't go down to 1 or 0, right? It starts with 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7 on the last day. But there's a decrease of bulls from on the holiday of Sukkot. And what the Talmud said is, just as on Sukkot, we decrease the bulls we sacrifice each and every day, Beit Shammai says on Hanukkah, we should decrease the number of candles by 1 every day. And now you might be asking yourself, okay, on Sukkot we decrease, but what does that have anything to do with Hanukkah? And why would we even begin to compare bulls to candles? If you're asking that, that's a really good question. And to answer that one, we have to turn to the book of Maccabees. The books of Maccabees are some different tellings of the Hanukkah story, historical books that don't appear in the Jewish Bible, but we have them as outside works. They are, excuse me, some Christian Bibles contain the Maccabees as part of intertestamental books, like between the Jewish Bible and the Christian Bible. But they were Jewish books written by the Maccabees and their descendants to tell the story of Hanukkah. They each tell roughly the same story, but with a little different nuance. And here's what ties together the text we were looking at today. The book of Maccabees says, after telling the story of the war and the recapture of the temple, says the Maccabees celebrated for 8 days with rejoicing in the manner of the Feast of Booths, remembering how not long before, during the Feast of Booths, they had been wandering in the mountains and caves like wild animals. Therefore, bearing ivy wreathed wands and beautiful branches and also fronds of palm, right, echoes to a lulav, they offered hymns of thanksgiving to God who had given them success in purifying the temple, and they decreed that this holiday that they were celebrating this year would happen in successive years as well. So what's the connection? Well, think about this. Right, if Hanukkah, which happens in Kislev in the winter, celebrates when the Maccabees reclaimed and cleaned up the temple and restarted celebrations there, this passage notes that in the months before they were fighting the war and they weren't able to celebrate the holidays in their normal way because they were engaged in warfare, and actually they were hiding in the mountains and caves. If you go to Israel and you go to the Maccabim area between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv in the hills, you can actually crawl through some of the caves that we think the Maccabees actually hid in, and we have some good archaeological evidence for that. But what happens? They got to the temple and they said, all right, we cleaned up the temple, we want to use it. And they decided to have to do like a makeup holiday of Sukkot, which they had missed the previous fall because of the battle. And so the first Hanukkah ever was really a delayed Sukkot. And what the Maccabees did after that was declared Hanukkah should become a holiday in its own right. But the first year, it was a make-up Sukkot holiday. And since that first celebration of Hanukkah is tied to Sukkot, that lends some credence to this explanation of Beit Shammai and the model that Beit Shammai chooses to say, let's light candles the way Sukkot sacrificed bulls, because the first Hanukkah was Sukkot. And so, even though the numbers are different, Shammai says start with 8 candles and go down to 1, just like the sacrifices the Maccabees would have done on the first Hanukkah when they were reenacting Sukkot in addition to celebrating their victory. All right, I'm going to stop the share there. I'm back to the screen. I see that while we were looking at those last slides, we got a number of comments in the chat. Julie, by some chance, you've been tracking those comments? There's some questions or things we should shout out, or we can just have people put new questions or comments in the chat if they want to make?
We can. I know there was a hand or two, and there were responses that you already addressed from previously. So I know that Bubba had a hand raised.
Oh, I think Bubba said he's okay.
Oh, okay.
He just has his hand raised. He's waving.
Okay. Robert Epstein.
I'm not sure I'm responding to a question, but I just want to, 2 phrases came at me in 28, 1 to 2, where it says, God says, a pleasing odor to me. And in 2 Maccabees, where God said that God will have his own holy place. These are phrases that personify God. And there are 1,000 other phrases, similar phrases. So it would be a struggle for people to think of God in other ways, other than a form of a person. We've overcome that in recent centuries, but I can see that where it was a lot to overcome because it was central to the writing in the Bible. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Robert. That's a great comment, right? The list of sacrifices in this week's Parsha, in this week's Torah portion, the intention is, right, to make an offering to God, and part of that is not just giving of our crops and of our animals to God. Part of that is about somehow God is pleased by the odor of the sacrifice, right? The smell of the burning meat, right? It's the barbecue smell, I guess, that must have been in the temple. Somehow they saw as pleasing to God, right? And both that and also the notion that God resides, somehow God's presence resides in the temple, is present both in the Torah and in the book of Maccabees, and it has this image of first God as someone who who smells, and then also God as an entity that like is located in a particular place. Strong images in the biblical tradition that modern theology shifts from that song. All right, I see a lot of questions about what's the connection here to the Parashat Pinchas. I just want to respond to those. The last chapters of Parashat Pinchas are where the sacrifices that are given in the temple on holidays are listed. So while some of Pinchas is about continuing the plot of the narrative of the book of Bamidbar, there's also a legal section that deals with sacrifices in particular in the last 2 chapters. And it happens that the sacrifices of Sukkot set up the pattern for how Beit Shammai says we should light candles on Hanukkah. So that's a piece. There's also, Lisa mentioned this in the text, there is connection in Jewish literature also between the character of Pinchas, who stands up on behalf of God. This is actually the end of last week's parasha, and goes to defend the Jewish people by taking arms, in a forceful military type way. And sometimes Pinchas and his zealousness is compared to the Maccabees and theirs as well. But you are correct that this week's journey in Parashat Shavua, we went to a legal passage and not to the plot pieces which come earlier in the Parsha. I thought it might be interesting for us to take a look at this connection. I see Esther you're raising your hand. You want to ask her? I don't know if Julie, she's right on my screen next to you. I don't know where there we go.
First of all, isn't it true that according to halacha, not custom, one candle is enough?
Oh, yes, that is true. You can the minimum you can do on Hanukkah is to light one candle each night.
Yeah.
That is true.
And my second comment, I think you talked about the korbanot. To me, the korban tamid is what gives structure to our life. So I think it's one of the most important things. It's like we pray, Shacharit, Ma'anchan, Mariv. It's the structure to our life.
That is true, right? One of the things that I like that point, right? In these passages where they list the sacrifices, the first one, which is about every day we make regular sacrifices to God. And some of that echoes throughout Judaism, Jewish practice, that there are many of our practices, prayer in particular, which is modeled on sacrifices in some ways, that part of Jewish living is about regular commitments in everyday life and not just the special.
And the third thing that I like about this parasha is what I'm quoting Rabbi Sachs and Rabbi Cook. They said that leadership needs timing. And he gives an example, Rabbi Sachs gives the example that there was a strike of coal when what's her name? The Prime Minister, Thatcher, what's her name? There was a woman, the Iron Lady. I have a senior moment, don't remember her name. So when there was a strike in 1951, she gave in, but 3 years later, she had enough coal that her timing was perfect, that she could stand up to them. And Rav Kook brings the same idea, that timing and leadership are very important together.
That's true for both Pinchas and the Maccabees, right? And right, the Maccabees I like that connection because not every revolt that the Jews took up in the ancient world against the empires that oppressed them they weren't always successful. The Maccabees were successful. There were many other revolts that failed, that made it harder. And that's why in some ways Hanukkah stands out as a holiday. Our friends in the chat are giving us Margaret Thatcher as the name we were looking for. We have these. Oh, I see. Joel, are you raising your hand to make a comment? Joe Batelski. There we go. You're on mute.
I think this parsha with Pinchas and his descendants were rewarded by God for his actions taken against this Israeli man and woman, in which Pinchas killed the guy.
Yeah.
And again, this is a difficult thing for me to, killing, because you didn't follow God's orders of sleeping with this woman. But yet this whole parsha is named Pinchas. and he's being rewarded for this action. So,
Yeah.
so comment on this, Rabbi. Why is this so important?
Thank you, Joel, for raising this. So I'll give a quick summary before I respond. Right at the end of last week's Parsha, there's an incident that the Torah describes that the Israelites were in proximity to the Midianites, one of the other tribes in the area, and a tribe they weren't supposed to intermingle with. And there's an incident where an Israelite man and a Midianite woman were in public together, and Pinchas takes a spear and kills both of them. And at the beginning of this week's Parsha, he's heralded by God for his standing up and taking action to squash licentious behavior that was deemed inappropriate. And I think what I love about your question, Joel, with that is Pinchas in the Torah is praised, and in rabbinic literature also. I have the same read that you do of this text. It's a difficult story. It could be that the behavior that was happening was inappropriate, and it seems to me that Pinchas might have taken it too far, about where you draw the line. And one of the things that, this is more of a general comment than about Pinchas in particular, but one of the things that I really appreciate about Torah is the stories are complicated. And they leave us with these big questions, like, why would Pinchas be rewarded? And sometimes, some years when I read this Parsha, I look at the commentators who say, here's why, and I find answers that satisfy me. And sometimes I read it and I say, you know what? I think Pinchas went too far, and Pinchas didn't deserve the praise and the honor that the story brings to him. And in fact, maybe while, his heart might have been in the right place, his actions were a little bit across the line. But what I love about our tradition is it gives us voice to both embrace the biblical characters and critique the biblical characters. I think characters in the Bible, excuse me, all have their positive qualities and negative qualities. And what makes our story so interesting is that there's not always a clear answer. And what I love the most about what you said, Joel, is you raise a really good question that we've been talking about for centuries. Martha, do you want to jump in? I see your hand is raised, and we'll get around. We'll try to get around to everybody.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm deeply troubled because in part of our Torah, it says that we should love the stranger. And that's number one. And that goes against loving a stranger. Number two, this could have been transformed into a blessing by accepting this woman, as part of the tribe. Number three, according to Kabbalah says that actually there were, in the cosmic, there were soulmates. And Kabbalah doesn't treat Pinchas as well as the other commentary. That's all, a comment.
Nice. Well, Martha, that's a good reflection of our tradition has different takes, right? And right, I like that Kabbalistic interpretation that you mentioned, that actually, these people were soulmates, and what Pinchas did was, with an act of violence, destroyed a certain, order in the world, and maybe he shouldn't have been praised. And it's also right there, the other thing from your comment that I think is reflective is the Jewish people's perspective on, other nations over time has changed. The Torah is more xenophobic about certain other tribes than we are today, and we live in an age where the vast majority of the Jewish people is welcoming of people who want to be part of us, and the Torah doesn't have that voice. And so while the Torah is an inspiration for us, we also sometimes note in stories like this that some of the other people language that's in the Torah doesn't reflect how we live Judaism today, or what that looks like. All right, Tanya, yes.
Okay, Rabbi, I just wanted to make a comment or a couple of comments about the Pinchas story. Even though it bothers us in Western culture, I kind of see it, and I could be wrong. This was an honor killing for God. And in other cultures, especially in the East, even though we look at it as really bad, honor killings, he was really concerned about God's name and God's reputation. And this was a sacred assembly and a sacred community, and they were in mourning over the desecration and the sins with the Moabites. And this, in my opinion, it was an honor killing for God's name. Because in Judaism, the sanctification of God's name is very important. And these people had totally committed this act in the midst of the camp, and the people were already mourning. I'm not saying it was right, but that's sort of the way I read it from more of an Eastern perspective.
Thank you, Tanya. That's interesting. As you say that, I'm thinking about, I haven't read it in a long time, but I think it's James Clavell's Shogun. As a kid, I read that, right? A different culture, right? Different cultures have different understandings, right? And the concept of honor killing, there is some of that, right? There are passages in the Torah that explore whether or not that fits into the Jewish view of the world. And the Torah does seem to frame it that way. And that's another angle on, a way to think about this story. And one of the reasons why the Torah praises Pinchas is for exactly what you're saying, that there was honor in his actions. And I could see both that side, that there's honor in his actions, and the voices that we heard earlier that said, well, there might be some honor of his actions, but, I draw the line at killing as well. Stephen Lamb. See your hand is up.
Okay. I think it's important that both Zimri and Cosby were children of the heads of ancestral homes of the Israelites, Simon, and Midianite, Zur, which in essence was equivalent to a marriage of two peoples. And that I think preventing this and eliminating it was his holy act.
Right, if the people involved in the incident, right, were tribal leaders, right, marriage between tribal leaders is sometimes the merging of tribes. And maybe that elevates this from just an individual incident to something with more consequences. Yeah. I do want to say it's interesting. I love, right, there were some questions from a number of you in the chat earlier on about, wait, how does this, to the text I brought, connecting the legal passages about sacrifices at the end of the Parsha, the Hanukkah, how does it all relate to the Parsha? And our conversation after that has been drawn towards the story. Because I have two thoughts about that. One is, the story of the Torah pulls us, and the narrative pulls us a lot. And there's a lot to talk about in the story. Just to get you into my head a little bit, one of the reasons why I picked the sacrifice texts and a way in which they found their way into Jewish tradition was just to give voice, to shine the spotlight on the last two chapters of Pinchas a little bit. Right, when I'm studying the book of Bamidbar and studying it to teach the narrative, the last two chapters of Parashat Pinchas, I'm likely to skip. Or to skim fast, right? But our tradition also teaches, right, every chapter, every verse, every word in the Torah has its holiness. And while we're drawn to stories, there's also like insight and other things in the other places as well. And while I appreciate the pushback with the people who said, hey, what does this have anything to do with Parshat HaShavua? My pushback to the pushback is like, we have to look at those other passages and see what our tradition does that as well. But at the same time, like I love the passion for the narrative that we're hearing from the voices in the conversation, and then the comments about that in the text. I think it's an interesting thing with the way we interact with Torah, and we see that here too. We had the hand just went away. There was a iPad wanted to talk, but I wasn't sure exactly who that was because it wasn't as personalized.
iPad, I just asked you to unmute yourself. iPad, if you still want to ask your question.
I would just, thank you. I would just make a comment. I think there was a terrible plague going on in the camp, and Pinchas's actions seem to have stayed the plague. So I think as a previous commenter that this was in defense of God and the people. And I think we should take that into consideration.
Right, that's true, right? We in Bamidbar as a whole, right, we see many incidents of the people not doing exactly what God or Moses want them to do. And sometimes the earth opens up and swallows them, like Korach's rebellion, and sometimes there's a plague, and sometimes there's thirst, right, because there's not enough water. And right, the Torah does credit Pinchas as his action stopped the divine punishment. Right, in the biblical narrative, the actions of the Israelites led to some sort of divine punishment, that disease and illness, and Pinchas' action put that to rest. So definitely from the Torah's perspective, what Pinchas did was good. In the read of the story, and I love the back and forth that in this conversation that. The voices both defending Pinchas and questioning Pinchas. Like, that's a good Torah discussion. Greta, you have your hand up.
Thank you. I just want to pin something on to what Tanya was saying. I was struggling with this portion as well, because it seems that a lot of the blame is placed on the woman, who seems dually disadvantaged in the text, and that she's a woman and she's also an outsider in other ways. And for me, that's a lot of where the struggle with this text comes from, because it seems as though God is rewarding teaming up on the disadvantaged almost.
That's a powerful comment. Thank you for that. Right? It's just, and for me, I'm just love, like, what I hear in all these comments, especially in the alternating voices about this incident is troubling, and then this incident is, Pinchas's action are a good thing. We bring two different takes of the way Jews have read this story. I mean, it's hard to land, for me, it's always hard to land squarely in one camp or another, because there are compelling voices on each side. But you also, Greta, you brought into that also, like, who's in a position of power here, who's disadvantaged here. It happens in this parsha also, we didn't touch on today, but there's the section about the daughters of Shlofchad. There's a passage about 5 daughters whose father died, and they petitioned to allow women, when there are no sons, to allow women to inherit. And there's a story about how Moses and God respond to that. Doesn't go all the way to say that sons and daughters should be kept equal, but it is a moment where the Torah takes a stand. If there aren't sons, let's give women property, which some read as progressive in its day, and some say that's not really progressive because women are still second class. But often that's cited as a text to look at about gender equality, and a text we look at, and a moment of some people who don't always have voice coming forward and petitioning Moses, and successfully, right? We've seen stories over the last few weeks of people petitioning Moses in the wrong way, and the daughters of Shlofchad do it in the right way, which might be like they get the answer they want, and it might be not just what they're asking for, but also how they do it. So there's a leadership question about how do you lead from a place of not authority to, make change, and there's some messages there as well. So thanks, Greta, for raising that. Martha, did we hear from you before?
We did. We have heard from Martha. Is there anyone we have not heard from yet? And if not, also Esther has a hand up. So there's Esther, Martha, Steve, who we've all heard from. Is there anyone who would like to share who we haven't heard from yet? And then otherwise, we might not be able to get to all of the additional comments. It's almost 11:15, but that will be up to you, Rabbi. Oh, so Jennifer, go ahead.
Hi, good morning. I was thinking more like legacy. What kind of legacy are you leaving behind as leadership? Usually a leader stands in front of the people, but not too far in front, as they want to lead the people. And it's the legacy that they leave over. That's the important part. And then I thought about inheritance. What about the 5 daughters of Moshe? Did they receive a portion of inheritance?
The daughters of Moshe?
Yeah.
What you said?
Right. Or from, I can't pronounce the name, like Septa or something?
The daughters of Slofchad, is that what you're
Yes, the
to?
5 daughters of Slofchad.
Right, the daughter of Slofchad, right. Their petition was successful, and they, the tradition holds that both the Torah and later that they did get their father's inheritance, right, and from the biblical, right, it sets precedent in biblical law that in the absence of male heirs, the female heirs can own property. In the biblical era, that is a step forward for gender equality, but that is there too. But I think, Jennifer, that's a good way to bring our conversation to the close, because I think what you said echoes a lot of people's comment about the story today. There are a lot of characters in this week's Parsha that show leadership in one way or another. And I think a framing question is, what's the legacy that each of them lived? Which are the ones that we're drawn to as the kind of leaders we want to follow and or emulate? And there are lots of different models in the Parsha, right? And I guess the follow-up question is, like, do different times call for different kinds of leadership? And we heard voices today say that as well, that, some of the leadership that we saw in certain circumstances seems questionable, but are there times when it might be appropriate? I appreciate it, everybody coming today, and thanks for indulging me in our journey through the sacrificial laws at the end and the connection to Hanukkah. And I appreciate circling back to the plot as well. I know really to do Parshat Shavua justice, like we could meet for an hour and a half each morning to really study the whole thing. And the challenge of the 45-minute window is, the balance between trying to cover all of it quickly or zoom in on something one way or the other. We did a little bit of both, so thank you for that. And Julie, thank you for hosting and facilitating.